Hello and welcome to In Conversation With, the monthly podcast series brought to you by the team behind the Global Cosmetics newsfeed. Today's episode is a special one as we reflect on one of the most pivotal years in beauty and personal care. Throughout 2025, scientific progress, environmental urgency, and shifts in consumer culture converged to reshape the industry more rapidly than ever before. We've seen biotech reach commercial scale, AI step confidently into the everyday routine, and as sustainability move beyond aspiration into expectation. Meanwhile, emotional well-being, age-specific needs, inclusivity, and streamlined routines have all emerged as defining forces, influencing not only the people who purchase, but how brands innovate. So in this episode, we'll be exploring the major drivers behind this year's evolution and, importantly, where they are taking us next as we look towards 2026. To make sense of it all, I'm joined by two returning guests, Amarjit Sahota, founder of Ecovia Intelligence, and Maggie Spicer, founder of Source Beauty. Welcome back, Amarjit and Maggie. Let's dive into this year that defined the future of beauty. As always, the clearest signals come from the people buying the products. Consumer expectations shifted meaningfully in 2025, from what they prioritized in their routines to the values they expected brands to uphold. Amarjit, how did the evolving consumer priorities, particularly around conscious purchasing, ingredients awareness, and value-driven simplicity, influence the direction of the sustainability movement this year?
The first thing I want to say is it's not been easy for consumers. We're still suffering from a cost of living crisis here in UK, in Europe, in US as well. Inflation is a really big issue. Consumers are having to make very difficult decisions. When they go shopping, do they want to buy the green products, which can be more expensive, more sustainable, or do you go for the value options? The cost of living crisis continues to affect consumer behavior. But from research that we find, in terms of environmental issues or sustainability issues, climate change is still top of mind. Consumers are looking at the carbon footprint of their products. They want to make the right decisions in terms of buying products which have a lower carbon footprint. But for beauty products, that's not always so easy, because when you're buying apples or you're buying potatoes, it's very easy to see if it's produced in the UK or in Europe, or if it's been coming in from New Zealand. But for beauty products, because they're multi-ingredient products, it's not so easy to make those right decisions. So climate change is number one, and then plastic pollution is number two, the biggest sustainability issue that we see for consumers. And this is where consumers are making decisions. They're going towards refillables. They're buying products which have a lower packaging footprint, either in terms of eco-design approach or using greener materials in their packaging. And the third issue for consumers is biodiversity loss. They're asking more questions about ingredients. They're looking at things like palm oil. They're looking at if it's linked to deforestation, and they're looking at ethical sourcing of ingredients, whether it's palm oil, cocoa, or coffee, etc. In terms of consumer trends, apart from the cost of living crisis, the big issues are climate change, plastic pollution, and biodiversity.
Maggie, consumers this year clearly push for clearer communications and more accountability from brands. Which behaviours or expectations have the strongest influence on the regulatory conversation globally?
I think it's been really interesting to see how the last kind of decade of what we refer to as the clean beauty movement has now emerged in both state level regulations here in the US and also at the federal level. What we saw were consumers saying, well, there are certain categories of ingredients, certain classes of materials that we don't believe should be in beauty and personal care products. And so retailers really stepped in to create these clean beauty programs. We saw a real boom of brands who were using that clean beauty marketing. And we know that's not really a regulated term, especially here in the US. So it became this really tricky issue of consumers demanding transparency, but also not necessarily having the scientific and technical qualifications to understand the information that they were getting from the brands. And so what we've seen now is the emergence of these apps like Yuka and EWG, Think Dirty, where they're fitting into the middle ground of the consumers want to understand what's in the products, but they're not technical or scientific experts. So these apps will attempt to provide a score or a hazard rating to different products based on the INCI list. And this is going to end up compounding the problem because, as we know, without really understanding the percentage in which an ingredient is present in a product, it's really difficult to make an accurate safety assessment. And so we're now swinging back to the states and regulators thinking about this question of how do we actually tackle in a meaningful and transparent way the issue of certain classes of ingredients in personal care products. So we've got things like Washington State's Toxic-Free Cosmetics Act. We've got different initiatives happening at the state level where certain classes of ingredients are being targeted. And honestly, I think this might be a good thing because as much as we struggle in the US with having a patchwork of different state regulations that aren't necessarily consistent, at least bringing these issues to the state level rather than just leaving it at the consumer level and letting kind of the market fill the gap will give us a baseline for some level of reliability and some level of real transparency in terms of how these classes of ingredients are being used and marketed in the beauty industry. And then from there, we can engage as an industry to say, well, what's the best way for us to move forward rather than just allowing the fear mongering to continue, because consumers want transparency and I can understand and empathize with that. But it's really about how do we make sure they're getting the right kind of information that is answering the questions that they need without overwhelming them with information.
And of course, none of these changes we saw this year would be possible without rapid advancements of technology. Innovation across science and systems shaped everything from formulation to supply chains. Amarjit, which emerging technologies have had the greatest impact on enabling or scaling sustainability efforts in 2025?
Good question. AI is the first thing that comes to mind. But before I talk about AI, when you look at cosmetic formulations, a big trend is the growing use of biotechnology. And this involves plant cell technology. We're seeing companies like Mabel Biochemistry, Croda Beauty, and quite a few other companies. What they're doing is they're producing cosmetic actives in the lab. They're taking a small part of a leaf or the plant material, and then they're taking out the active material and they're reproducing that in the lab, and they're producing cosmetic ingredients. So this is really taking off. You're seeing quite a lot of companies introduce novel actives or cosmetic active ingredients through that process. And the other area there for biotech is precision fermentation. And this is similar to what's in the food industry, where you're having, say, animal-free meat products or cow-free dairy products. What they're doing is they're producing ingredients by fermentation process using enzymes or using yeast. And what we're seeing is new startups coming up like Smay, Melton Marble, No Palm Ingredients in Netherlands, and they're making sustainable fats and oils, which are very similar to, say, palm oil, coconut oil being used by the beauty industry, but they're being produced without land. So this is a big development. We've seen some of these ingredients being launched in the last 12 months, 18 months and being commercialized. The price parity is still an issue, but as they produce to scale, the prices are expected to become closer to what you find, say, from the plant kingdom. And now that's biotech. The second issue, or the second big trend, is really AI. And it's not just in the beauty industry. You're seeing it across the board for food industry, consumer goods, electronics, etc. And it's having a pervasive influence in terms of production and marketing. So what we're seeing in terms of the formulation side, we're seeing platforms like Cavello, Potion AI. They're helping formulators select green ingredients or ingredients with a lower environmental impact. They're helping them develop sustainable formulations. And we're also seeing big IT companies like IBM, they're using generative AI to help companies like L'Oreal formulations with a lower environmental impact. So that's on the formulation side. AI is also being involved in marketing. What we're seeing is more and more customization and personalization of skincare products or personal care products using platforms like Perfect Corporation, Hout AI, they're using Skin GPT. And what that's doing is they're having consumers using apps and they're coming up with their personalized skincare products or hair care products based on their skin type, based on their weather conditions, etc. So AI is having a very big influence in terms of the formulation, production, as well as the marketing of beauty products.
And Maggie, as these technologies advance, regulators have had to adapt. Which developments do you feel played the largest role in shaping updated safety or sustainability frameworks this year?
I definitely think the deep dive that we just got on AI is entirely on point, because you can't be in the industry and not be hearing about AI being integrated in all of these different platforms and tools that are being made available to brands and formulators and purchasing and design teams. It's really embedding so much new data and accessibility to that data into every function pretty much that we can think of. Where I'm seeing some really interesting kind of movement is in supply chain transparency. And this is something that really intersects with what companies of all sizes need to be thinking about as they're really competing in the global marketplace, because we're seeing more and more jurisdictions with regulations that are requiring companies to do supply chain due diligence. Now, especially in Europe, these tend to be really targeted at the larger enterprises. But what we're seeing is even when the larger enterprises are the ones that have the direct obligations under these supply chain due diligence obligations, the business benefits of actually engaging in that kind of supply chain transparency really does trickle down. So no matter if you're a business doing $500,000 in sales or 500 million, the benefit to engaging in these new technologically driven platforms, understanding the risks within your supply chain, not just on things, there's the obvious, there's the geographic risks, but also just understanding political instability. Where are you sourcing your raw materials from areas that might be climate change hotspots, where a major temperature fluctuation could decimate the source of the material that you're creating or that you're sourcing from those countries. It really does tie into business resiliency. And so these new kind of visibility platforms that are giving companies that originally would have never had this level of upstream visibility in their supply chain, they're really empowering these companies to not just understand at a high level where their sustainability risks are, but really understand the business resiliency that they can be embedding or at least addressing within their supply chains. And at the same time, as they scale or as they sit within these larger parent companies, meet those regulatory obligations on supply chain due diligence.
And beyond technology, environmental realities continue to act as a powerful catalyst. Climate pressure, resource scarcity, and waste concerns heavily influence both consumer behavior and corporate decision-making. Amarjit, how did the environmental pressures influence global decision-making, particularly around product formats, materials, and life cycle choices?
Okay, in terms of environmental trends, I would say carbon footprint is still probably the number one issue that most cosmetic companies are looking at. And because of that, what we're seeing is more and more companies are measuring not just their scope 1, scope 2, but scope 3 emissions. And because of that, you're seeing ingredient companies increasingly measuring the carbon footprint of their raw materials. What we've seen in the last year or so are companies like Croda Beauty, Oleon, Lubrizol. They're undertaking life cycle assessments of their ingredients. They're working out carbon footprint, and in some cases, they're actually giving the product carbon footprint of their ingredients to their customers. So companies like Unilever or Beiersdorf, or even some of the small brands, when they're working out their formulation, they can actually work out the carbon footprint of their formulation as well as their carbon footprint of their own business. So that's a new trend where we're seeing climate change affecting companies, that companies across the whole value chain are working out the carbon footprint. The second issue there in terms of environmental trends, we're seeing divergence between Europe and North America. In the USA, you've got the Trump administration, and because of that, a lot of American companies are rolling back in terms of their sustainability plans, in terms of their objectives or goals to reduce their carbon footprint. So we're expecting to see a bit more divergence between US and Europe on here in Europe, or you can say across the pond in Europe. The EU is moving forward with this Green Deal. They want to become carbon neutral by 2050, and they're introducing all these new initiatives to reduce the carbon footprint or to become more sustainable as a continent. But in the USA, they're rolling back on terms of previous commitments. So those are the two big issues that we see. And related to that, packaging, plastic pollution is a big issue. Consumers want to make the right decisions. And because of that, in the beauty industry, we're seeing more and more companies move towards refillables. Companies are using biopolymers. They're using bioplastics, bamboo, wood, and waterless products. They're being packaged in paper, cardboard, etc. So that's still a big trend in terms of moving away from single-use plastics.
Maggie, from a regulatory perspective, which environmental priorities most directly guide policy updates or new compliance requirements in 2025?
I don't think we could talk about anything to do with packaging or environmental regulations in the US without talking about EPR. So extended producer responsibility is really taking off in the United States, and it's happening at the state level, much to the chagrin, I think, of many of the brands that are now doing their EPR reporting, because they're realizing how complicated it is to report to multiple states with different EPR standards. But we are really now at a point where these EPR programs are not just kind of hypothetical conversations. They are active. The reporting deadlines are in effect. The penalties are already in effect. So we're really seeing at the state level, 2025 being the kind of the year of EPR becoming a very big issue. Now, many brands have known about this for a few years and some had time to prepare, but I think what we're seeing is a lot of brands assumed this would slow roll because of the priorities of the Trump administration shifting away from regulation, shifting away from sustainability-focused initiatives. But in the absence of a strong federal program, the states really did take it upon themselves to push these EPR systems forward. And they're really building on the model that we already have in the US for things like mattresses or paint. We have EPR programs already, but there hasn't been one for beauty and personal care, or at least that directly affected beauty and personal care. So this has been a really big year for brands who are starting to, I think, wake up to the reality of how much work it is to do EPR compliance. And the flip side of that is that they're also waking up to the opportunity of understanding their own packaging supply chains, because when you start to really deep dive all the materials you're getting, the volumes that you're buying from, the countries that you're buying from, the volumes in which you have to buy those materials, it actually becomes a lot easier to do kind of strategic business planning. So thinking about things like tariffs and customs duties and where your big cost centers are. A lot of companies operate with a pretty significant level of blind spots within their supply chain on packaging. And so there has been this opportunity at the same time. There's a huge kind of imposition that these EPR programs have, which is that when you're spending all the time gathering this packaging data and meeting these new state level regulatory requirements, is there also a way to find a silver lining for the business? Can you find some areas of cost savings so that as we go into potentially a softer retail market in 2026, the profit and loss looks a little healthier. You're able to shore up some reserve funds by cutting costs in 2025 so that going into 26, you've got a little bit more of a buffer. So EPR has really been the big driver in terms of these environmental focused sustainability regulations. And then you've got adjacent regulations as well. So things like PCR mandates, for example, where you're essentially seeing a minimum threshold for recycled content in certain kinds of packaging. That's separate from EPR. So we're really looking at this like much more complicated ecosystem that brands in the US are having to face. But in the absence of federal movement, I would expect to see this trend continuing into 2026.
And that brings us to the broader landscape shaping business decisions. Regulatory, economic pressures, and evolving retail models all played major roles in determining how brands adapted this year. Amarjit, what were the most significant challenges and opportunities for brands navigating shifting sustainability expectations in this challenging market landscape?
I'd like to touch on regulations just the way Maggie did. And Maggie talked very well about the EPR and the patchwork of different state regulations in the USA. But in Europe, regulations are having a very big impact in terms of the sustainability discussion, but also sustainability is moving from a nice to have to something which is compliance, ESG. More and more companies are having to report what they're doing in terms of the environmental impacts, corporate governance, social aspects, etc. Now, just to briefly talk about the regulations, in Europe, we've had the EU deforestation regulation. It was delayed last year. It's been introduced just a couple of months ago, and it's going to go into effect for medium to large size companies this month. So EUDR is ensuring ingredients like palm oil as well as wood, timber, etc. is sustainably sourced. We've had the packaging and packaging waste regulation that was introduced in February 2025. And I believe EPR is a part of that or linked to that. You've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that's been introduced. And interestingly, the EU Green Claims Directive, which was going to have a very big impact in terms of the marketing of products and in terms of making green claims, that has actually been put on hold. In June of this year, the EU said that they were not going to introduce it in 2026 as it was planned, but they're going to temporarily put it on hold. So that's actually a big one because in Europe and in other parts of the world, brands are making a lot of claims about their products. They're making claims that they're free of contentious ingredients, that they're using environmentally friendly packaging or green formulations, etc. And this regulation was going to ensure that if any brand was making a green claim, that they're going to have scientific evidence behind that. And the second big part of that regulation was going to be to limit the number of eco-labels in the industry. So not just for beauty products, but for food products, etc. What we've seen is a big proliferation in eco-labels, third-party schemes like Organic, Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, Cosmos, etc. And this regulation was only going to allow new eco-labels to be introduced if they can prove that they are better or more robust than existing eco-labels. So for me, that was a big disappointment that the EU Green Claims Directive is not going to be introduced. It's been put on hold, and we're hoping that maybe next year or beyond that, it will come back to life and it will be introduced, because there's a lot of greenwashing in the industry, and we need a Green Claims Directive to help consumers make the right choices when they're buying green products or sustainable products.
Indeed, we do. And Maggie, which regulatory developments, whether national or international, created the most notable obstacle or opening for beauty brands in 2025?
In the US, I would say it's not one particular regulation. It's really the complete patchwork quilt of state level regulations that we're now looking at that's really creating this very complex landscape for beauty brands. it's something where I know companies that are operating in both the US and the EU also struggle with how do we think about EU member level rules and regulations versus those that happen at the EU level, but there's better system of harmonization. In the US, what we're seeing is where there's an absence of real federal movement, the states will step forward and put in place pretty aggressive or assertive state level regulations on things like how do you make environmental marketing claims. So when we think about the US, when we're talking about green marketing, we have the green guides. This is the guidelines that are issued by the Federal Trade Commission. They should have been updated already. We're overdue for the update. I don't anticipate we're getting them anytime soon. And in the absence of these new federal guidelines, California steps in and says, we're going to start to regulate who can say something is recyclable, for example. So brands operating in the US really have to think strategically around what are we doing? What is the baseline between all of these different environmental and sustainability focused regulations that we're thinking about? And how does that fit into our larger corporate strategy? So it's marketing, it's product development, it's product design. It really touches on all those critical operational pieces. And there are so many different regulations that kind of touch on all of those pieces that knowing what your sales channels are, knowing what applies to you, and then knowing what your corporate strategy looks like and how you can turn those obligations into something that is more of a business driver rather than just a complete cost center, I think is really what's going to make the difference for brands as they try to navigate what is now an increasingly complex landscape of state-level regulations.
With a clearer picture of the year behind us, it's worth looking at how these forces might evolve. If 2025 was a year of acceleration, 2026 is shaping up to be a year of consolidation and refinement. Amarjit, how would you summarize the journey sustainability has taken across 2025, and what do you anticipate would be the biggest areas of momentum in 2026?
Good question. It's been a very interesting year. There's been a lot of geopolitical change worldwide, mainly because of what's happening in the USA, and that's having repercussions to the sustainability agenda, from small things like import tariffs. A lot of European producers, let's say natural organic brands, clean beauty brands like Weleda, Dr. Hauschka, Neal's Yard Remedies here in Europe, they're having to deal with tariffs to sell their products in the USA, and they're having to make decisions. Some big companies can actually move their production to the USA, or they can do contract manufacturing, but a lot of the small brands can't do that. So from the finished products all the way to the raw materials, it's like aloe vera, oil, coconut oil, etc., which is being imported into the USA, is now being sold at higher prices. So there's a lot of inflation going on, and that's the first thing. And the second thing is related to the political climate in the USA. We're seeing divergence between Europe and North America. The UK is still following very much the European Union model in terms of regulations, in terms of sustainability, etc. The EU is moving forward with the Green Deal. They're introducing more and more regulations. They're trying to make the continent a lot more greener, and there's more and more sustainability reporting in Europe. But North America, I would say especially USA, seems to be moving in a different direction, because regulations are either being rolled back or they're not being introduced. Companies feel they don't need to do sustainability reporting, etc. We're going to see more divergence between Europe and North America in terms of sustainability, the way companies do business. It's very common for European cosmetic brands to come up with sustainability plans to give accurate numbers in terms of how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint, waste, energy usage, etc. In the USA, we're seeing less of that, mainly because there's not much pressure. So greater divergence. And related to that, Asia, what you're seeing in Asia, things are very fragmented in terms of the sustainability movement. Some countries like Japan and Korea, they're doing fairly well in terms of introducing regulations and doing innovation in terms of new products. Other countries are not doing so well. And what you're seeing is the companies which are selling internationally, brands like Amore Pacific, Shiseido, they're following Europe in terms of sustainability objectives, in terms of sustainability reporting, and the other companies are looking more and more like USA's, thinking, okay, we don't need to do this to sell to the USA. We don't need to report what we're doing to address our carbon footprint, how we're going to become carbon neutral, and what we're doing about our packaging, etc. So it's been an interesting year, but unfortunately 2026 looks like we're going to have more divergence in terms of the sustainability discussion because of these geopolitical issues.
And Maggie, from a regulatory standpoint, which developments from this year do you expect to evolve further or spark new frameworks as we moved into 2026?
I think there's probably two kind of themes that I would expect to see more movement on. The first, I know we've covered pretty extensively today, which is packaging design. So that is really one of the big inputs in regulations covering extended producer responsibility, in terms of PCR mandates, in terms of green marketing, because a lot of brands are primarily making claims around the sustainability of their packaging. And what we're seeing is that there are now going to be bigger drivers on the actual design of that packaging, whether it's designed for recyclability, refillability, compostability. We're seeing more pressure on actual kind of design criteria, but then also more guidance on how those claims are being made. Because when a brand wants to talk about their packaging sustainability, but they haven't necessarily designed the packaging with sustainability in mind, or they're relying on outdated narratives around what is truly sustainable in terms of packaging, then I think we see a lot of consumer mistrust. And even in the absence of updated marketing guidelines in the US on how we make those claims, you still, at the end of the day, want to make a sale to a consumer, and they need to trust you as a brand in order to buy from you. Or at the very least, they need to not think you're misleading them. So if you, as a brand, want to really capture the value of a consumer that maybe is deciding between two products and the tipping point might be an environmental attribute, that's really something to take note of, because it's not just a compliance obligation. It's really, how are we competing in a very complex and a very dense market? And if that's going to tip the scales in terms of what convinces consumers to buy you over your competitors, that's really powerful. The other theme that I don't think is really driven as much right now by regulation, but I do see it becoming quite a topic of conversation, is almost evolving from carbon, which we've seen a lot of in terms of brands really thinking about, how do we monitor our carbon footprint? How do we measure it? How do we report it out? In the EU, there are much more developed guidelines in terms of making claims about carbon. But what I'm seeing now is brands taking that foundation of, okay, we've looked at our carbon footprint, but we want to find something that actually speaks to our consumer a little bit more. And they're moving the conversation beyond carbon into nature-based solutions and biodiversity. And I think that's really exciting, because there's so much room for innovation, so much room for real creative storytelling and sourcing, and bringing consumers in behind the scenes of not just what are we doing on operations, but what does it look like to actually go on the ground and see the impact we're making and seeing where we're sourcing these ingredients. So I definitely see that conversation continuing in 2026, hopefully with a lot more nuance and a lot more awareness by brands of how they can be engaging in very meaningful sustainability work with that kind of climate and nature-focused lens.
And that brings us to the end of our special 2025 in Review episode. It's been a year where science, sustainability, culture and policy all moved at a pace, reshaping the beauty landscape and laying the foundations for a future that is more predictive, protective and planet positive. A huge thanks to Amarjit and Maggie for their insights, and to you, our listeners, for joining us. We'll be back next month as we turn our attentions to the innovations set to define 2026, a year where co-creation, scientific rigor, and next-generation sustainability will take center stage. Until then, take care, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next episode.